Welcome back to the channel. Let's pour a bearing. Back on the 8-horse Mogul project, and we're going to pour the rear bearing of the side shaft today with high pressure babbitt. That bearing was almost non-existent when I got the engine. It's the one that's back by the crankshaft, and it's going to be a three-dimensional positioning of that shaft, so we'll have to get a little creative on positioning that right and getting the gear mesh correct. So we're going to get going on that. The front bearing is in good shape, so we can use that to help position the shaft. Close up of the area we'll be working in today. This is the side shaft side of the engine, and that is the crankshaft with one gear of the 2-gear set for running the side shaft off the crankshaft. Side shaft runs at exactly half the speed of the crankshaft and 90 degrees to it. So this gear set's a little odd. It's almost a worm drive gear arrangement, and the teeth are quite long, and at any one time there's always 3 teeth engaged in this gear set. So what I'm doing here is taking a wire brush and cleaning up each gear tooth. We're going to use this gear set to help set our shaft in the right position for pouring. Once again, it's a three-dimensional set for this shaft, and I'm going to be just turning the crankshaft there a little bit so I can work my way around this gear. There's a little bit of wear on these gears, but I think they'll run all right. The rated engine speed is 450 RPM. I tend to slow them down just a little bit from that, probably around 300. There are some reasons why you wouldn't want to go much lower than that for a speed setting, and we'll get into that when we actually can show the parts why that is that way. But for now, we're just going to clean this up and then have a clean set of teeth there to work with and position that shaft into this bearing pour. Just a little more information about this gear set. They are unique to each size of Mogul, so an 8-horse gear set will not fit a 6-horse and so on there. So they are specialized to the size, and they are quite expensive. If you can find a gear place to make this gear set, it's going to run you about $600 for the set. This is the governor housing that we'll be pouring the bearing in. That large hole there is where the shaft goes and where the bearing is. And I'm just using some 80 grit sandpaper there to clean that up. I want to make sure to get this very clean so the babbitt sticks. There's actually dimples in there to keep the bearing from rotating. So we're just going to clean that up and get it so that it's nice and clean. So we get a good bearing adhesion. So just spend a little time doing that, and we'll move on to the next part. Well, now we need to clean up the side shaft itself. It's quite dirty. It's got a lot of primer and just grime on it. So these parts that go on this shaft are close tolerance parts, so the shaft and the parts themselves need to be clean. We need to get that gear on there, and we want it to fit in the proper place, so it just needs to be cleaned up. I'm going to be using a right angle grinder on it and cleaning it up with a nylon buffing wheel, and just going around the shaft here, cleaning it up, getting it nice and shiny, get a good finish on that, and then that'll help us make a nice bearing surface when we pour it. Well, the buffing wheel did a really good job cleaning this shaft up. Just going to take some sandpaper here and do a final dress on that shaft and final inspection, just making sure there's no burrs or anything here as I run along, and just do a final clean on it. So it looks pretty good, and we'll get this cleaned up and move on to the next step. Okay, quick test fit with the gear. Yeah, that works real nice. That's a good fit. should work real nice for locating that gear. No burrs or anything, so I think we're good to go there. Well, all the cleaning's done. Now the real prep work starts. Need to do some things to this shaft to get it ready to pour the bearing. First order of business is that washer there is going to go on the front side of the bearing. It's the actually the thrust washer for the governor. I'm putting some high temperature red RTV on it. I'm going to put it on the shaft there, and then that is going to be part of the seal to keep the babbitt from running out when we pour. Babbitt's just like water. When it's molten, it'll run everywhere, and we're going to do several things here to create a dam for that babbitt so that it doesn't run out. I'm going to put just a little bit of RTV there. There's a keyway there, and I don't want the babbitt to run out that keyway either, so just gonna get that ready to be sealed up when we put that shaft in the governor housing. Then all that RTV will be a good seal. Going to be wrapping a couple wraps of paper, just regular typing paper, around this shaft where the bearing's going to be. The bearing's going to be about 4 inches long, so just wrap a couple sheets of paper around there and tape it with regular old masking tape. That paper has a couple of purposes. One is to keep the babbitt metal from sticking to the shaft so that we can get the shaft out of the bearing after it's poured. And two, it provides a little bit of clearance between the bearing and the shaft itself. That's necessary for lubrication to get around in the bearing. Babbitt bearing that isn't properly lubricated will get hot, and it will end up just melting the bearing out, ruining the bearing. So we don't want to take all this time, make a good bearing, and then have it fail on us. So just taping the seam there, and I'm going to actually place that seam at the top of the bearing when I orient the shaft in the housing. You'll see that in a little bit, and the reason I do that is because the extra thickness of that masking tape will add just a little bit of clearance there, help make kind of an oil galley. I'm going to plug up the other end of that keyway there with the high temperature RTV, and then I'm going to tape the ends of the paper so that the babbitt does not run up under the paper and then stick the shaft to the babbitt metal. Okay, now we're going to do a little work on this gear. I'm going to take some high temperature RTV there and put a bead around the one side of this gear. This side of this gear is going to be pushed up against the back housing of the governor there where the bearing's going to be poured, and this will be another gasket surface for the babbitt itself. Okay, just a quick sight down the bearing cavity there. That's the back of the governor housing. That's where the bearing is going to be poured. So just a quick sight down that area there. One thing I will add, I use masking tape there in the other clip there, because if you use something like Scotch tape, it will vaporize in the babbitt and cause kind of some porosity problems. But regular old masking tape will just work just about like paper, and it will not affect the finish of the bearing. Taking the fuel pump and the fuel pump bracket off the engine. I'm doing this because there's a jack that I need to place at the back of this shaft to hold the shaft in a location and to set the proper clearance on the gears before we pour. So I just need to get this out of the way. Another note is I'm not skipping over very much of this video footage in this video just because the preparation is very important on pouring these bearings. The better job you do in your preparation, the better chances you have of having a good bearing. So not skipping through too much of the video here. We're ready to put the shaft in position. We need to be careful and not to disturb that paper that we put on the shaft. The paper's job is to protect the shaft from the babbitt, and if the paper's torn, it's going to stick to the babbitt, and then the shaft is going to be hard to get out. So I'm going to use a rag here. So when I put that shaft through there, if it drags on that casting, the edges of that casting are kind of sharp. It's not going to tear the paper, and hopefully that works. Okay, let's get this shaft installed on the engine. Shaft weighs about 30 pounds, so it's not real awkward or heavy. It's just got to be careful with it here. So it's just a little bit of a process to get that in there. There's that rag doing its job, kind of protecting that paper as it's coming out. The nose of the shaft is held on by this bracket. That's the magneto bracket, actually. It has a precise pin alignment on the flange that's on the bottom of the hopper and cylinder there. That's the location for that bracket, and then 2 bolts that holds it in. So that's going to be a good register point for the front of that shaft and take the weight and add some stability here so I can work on the other end without having to try to balance the whole thing. So I get those bolts in there, just finger tight's fine on those. Nothing really too drastic needed here. It's not going to go anywhere, and like I said, those alignment pins will do the job for us. So just get that screwed in there, and then we'll go to the next step. Okay, the nose of that shaft is secure. We're going to pull that rag out of there. It did its job, no damage to the paper. Paper's all intact, so that's great. We'll get this shaft secured on this tail end, and that's the last step in the process before we get to pouring. So we're going to take the gear set here, get that mesh set right. That's going to help register that position of that shaft basically before we put a jack against it. So we're going to do that now. Okay, here's a little information about International Harvester, the manufacturer of this Mogul engine. They actually made several engines types during this period, but International Harvester of this period has a very rigid assembly procedure for assembling the engines, and obviously I don't know that all the time. So I've got into cases where I get the engine basically together, and then I've got to take it apart and take some stuff off of it to get a part on there that just won't quite go on. So that's the case here. This shaft is in place in the governor bracket, and the gear that goes on that shaft will not go on with that governor bracket fully against the crankcase. So I'm going to loosen those bolts, pull that shaft out by moving the bracket out, and slip that gear on there. I need about 3/16 movement here, so not too much. Wouldn't want to go much more than that with that other end being secured, but I can get away with it now. So I'm going to back those bolts out and do that. And one note, I'm not going to be able to do it this way when I put the engine together the final time, because I am going to be concerned about the register of those gears and the shaft to the crank shaft. But right now we're just using the gear to register the shaft for pouring the bearing, so really timing doesn't really matter, and all I got to do is just line the gear up with the keyway, and I'll use the key to help adds some extra rigidity to the process. So I need to go about another 1/8 of an inch here and pull that out, and hopefully it'll go together. But it's kind of an annoying thing with there goes the gear, so that's good. It's just kind of an annoying thing with the International Harvester engine. It seems like they're the worst. I mean, sure, there's other manufacturers of engines, and everything has its set order for being put together, but International Harvester seems to be very rigid about that, and you just really get backed into corners all the time. So you got to just kind of plan your moves real slow and put them together the first time, kind of by trial there, and what makes sense. And sometimes you just get backed in a corner, and you just got to stop and back up and make another run at it. And now we'll tighten those bolts back and have that all registered in the right location. I got lucky on this one. I didn't want to have to try to balance that shaft and try to reach around, put that gear on there. That's just not going to be nice. So I can spin that shaft and line up the keyway to where the keyway is on the gear, and I'll be putting the key in there to lock it all in place, and then we can use those gears to our advantage here for doing some positioning of that shaft. And in goes the key. That'll keep that gear from moving around on us. So now I'm going to put some paper between those gears to get some clearance between them. I don't want them bottomed out when I put this jack up against them, but I need to get about 3/4 sheets of paper in there for clearance, but it's just not working out. That profile on those gears is more like a worm drive, like I've said before, and it's just hard to slide paper in there. If they were typical straight bevel gears, you could do that, but not in this case. So I'm going to just fold up some paper and try that. Okay, moving to the other side of the bearing, the front side. There's a washer that we put on that shaft before putting the shaft in that bracket, and it's got RTV on it. It's got that red high temperature RTV. That's going to be our first level defense for leaks of molten babbitt. So I'm just going to get that slid into place and let that RTV set up for a few hours. Same thing with that gear on the back side. There is RTV on that too, so all that just needs to set up, and then we'll have a first level seal there. We'll be doing 2 other steps for sealing up these bearings. One is putting some casting compound on there, and then also some duct tape to hold that casting compound in place. All 3 of those together makes a nice system for not having any leaks, and if a leak ever starts, you might as well just stop pouring, because there's no way to correct it or anything. Babbitt's very hot, and you're just not going to reach in there and get it to quit flowing until it freezes up on its own. Okay, we'll skip forward about an hour. I've got this shaft in location. I ended up folding some paper and putting it in the gear teeth for clearance, and then I used a V-block with a screw bottle jack there. Note that on the lower left-hand side I got a piece of steel there down on the pallet. That's got 2 purposes. One, it gives a good stable platform for that jack, and 2, it'll be a splash guard. If I pour and have some babbitt run down on that wood, it won't set it on fire. So got this casting compound. It's about the consistency of Play-Doh. It's kind of weird stuff, and I'm just going to pack that in there the best I can. It'll be the second line of defense for leaks, the first being the RTV. So the theory is if the RTV fails, then it'll hit this casting compound and hopefully slow down enough that it freezes in place and loses temperature and sets up and doesn't just run all over the floor. I'm going to use this little punch to push it back in there, because I just can't get my fingers back in there. It doesn't have to be real tight, but just needs to take up any voids there. I'm going to do that on both sides of that gear best I can, and just work it in there, getting this cavity filled up so the babbitt won't run out. Here's an in view of that. Got the casting compound put all around that gear the best I can, and I'm just going to pack some regular old duct tape in there. This is the third level defense against leaks. It's going to hold that casting compound in place. That stuff, like I said, is about like Play-Doh, and it does get pliable the hotter it gets, so you can't have that move or fall off as you're heating, and then it's just not going to do anything. So this duct tape is going to hold it in place and be a third level defense against leaks. Hopefully the babbitt doesn't make that far, but if it does, hopefully the duct tape stops it and keeps it from running all over the floor. I'm just going to put that duct tape all the way around that gear, and then we'll be done with that. Okay, last piece of duct tape, and we are ready to start preheating the castings. 20 minutes into the video, and now we are ready to start preheating all of our surfaces. First, let's talk about how I stay safe. Babbitt will hurt you and hurt you fast. It's 725 degree pour. I wear a long jacket there, a face shield, and a beanie. And I do wear gloves, so just stay safe and keep the hobby fun. I use these halogen work lights, not LED, but halogen. They're 500-watt lights. I use 2 of them to do my preheating for me. It takes about 2 hours. I can get this casting up locally about 300 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a good start, so I just let that soak for a couple hours that way. And then after that, then I'll use a torch, just a propane torch, and try to get some additional heat in there while the babbitt's melting. I want to get this up about 450 or so would be a good deal, but it's hard to do because this big casting is just soaking the heat away from it, and it's just a continual process. So just going to keep preheating this while the babbitt melts, and then we'll be pouring. Going to talk a little bit about the babbitt here while we watch this time lapse of the melting process. I just use a turkey fryer, propane, just to melt this babbitt down. I go kind of slow with it because the babbitt that I use is high-speed babbitt. It's a higher temperature than just regular lead. It's about 725 is where it melts at, and that is tin based, so there's a lot of tin in it. There's a little bit of copper and a little antimony as well, but primarily tin. And if you heat it too severely, it will just oxidize the tin out, and then it's just ruined. So I use a stir stick there to stir it up because it is a mixture. It's not an alloy, and the metals will separate out. So you just got to keep it stirred. And I also use that stick as a temperature guide. I'll put it in the molten babbitt for about 3 seconds. If it comes out and it's charred black, then I know that the temperature is about right to pour. I tried to use my infrared heat gun on it, and it just didn't work real well, so I went back to that. One final stir, and then I'll be cleaning the slag impurities and stuff off the top of the babbitt here, and then we'll be pouring in just a little bit. Time to pour. We've done our prep work and all the preheating, and babbitt's ready to go. Sorry about the camera angle here, but where the camera really needed to be is where I needed to be to pour, and I always make a clear path between the ladle area and the place where I'm going to pour. I always actually walk that before I pour, just to make sure there's not something to trip over, and then I'd have molten babbitt flying everywhere, and that wouldn't be good. But we're going to be pouring in that little 1/4-inch hole back there by the base of the crankshaft there, and right in the middle of the assembly. That's where all the babbitt's going to go. So I usually start out pouring and then increase speed as I go. Just pour as fast as I can, and let it just overrun when it gets done. That way there's no chance of it freezing and not doing a good pour. So hopefully we'll get a good pour out of this. And here we go. We're going to pour. We're going to pour in that little hole there. You can see that babbitt's melted real good. Just going to start pouring real slow, and then just increase the speed, And there it is. There it's full. That was it. 25 minutes of video, and that's all there is to it. Little spill over there is fine. That'll clean up, and I'm glad to put that metal down there because that babbitt ran out on the metal piece there below. But that babbit's still hot, even though it's cooled off and solidified. It's still several hundred degrees, and it's one dangerous thing about babbit. It doesn't turn red or anything when it's hot. It just looks the same as room temperature. So we'll see. I let this babbit set overnight, and then we'll pull it apart and see what kind of bearing we got. Well, it's next day and everything's cooled down. We're going to get this casting compound out of here, get the key removed, and see if we can get the gear to come loose. Actually, there was a little bit of babbit got in that keyway and kind of stuck the shaft, as we'll see here in a little bit. A little hard to get it out of there, but anyway, we'll get the key out of there, and you can kind of see there's a little bit of babbit on it there. But not too bad, not too many leaks, as I think that was actually the only leak, and yeah, that gear's stuck, so we're going to have to do some work on that. Well, I got the V-block and jack removed from the end of the shaft, so it's all clear, and we're going to work on getting this mag bracket back off of here. Remember, it's held on with 2 bolts and that precision pin, so I'm going to get that taken off of there, and then that shaft will only be held by the shaft going through the bearing. So that's all that's holding it now, so I should be able to jiggle that around a little bit. I want to be a little careful with that bearing. I don't want to damage it or distort it or anything, but it's moving a little bit, but it is pretty stuck in there actually, so I'm going to have to work on that. I've never had a bearing stick this tight, so I'm not sure what really is going on here, so I'm going to keep working on it. Well, fast forward about an hour and a half, there comes the gear off. I had to drive that shaft out. I had a little bit of babbit get in the keyway. So it's what's kind of jamming it up here and making it hard. I just don't want to score or damage that shaft. So I ended up putting a little oil on it, and the paper actually was binding up in there, as I found out later. So yeah, it's working out now, just slow and steady, and just that bracket's moving because the bolts are loose. I'm not flexing it that much. They're just loose. So anyway, so it's coming out, so I just keep working it out there, and there it is. First look at the bearing, that looks really good. I'm really satisfied with that. A little bit of debris in there, paper and such. We'll get that cleaned out, and then I got to get the casting compound out of there too and clean that RTV out. But let's clean it up. Now I'm clearing out that oil passage. Remember, we poured a bearing through that, poured the whole bearing through it, so it's full of babbit. So it's the only way that bearing gets oil. So got to clear that out. I'm using a small drill bit there, undersized. Final size will be 7/16 for this quarter MPT thread. But I'm just using a small drill bit here to break through and remove the majority of the material, because I don't want to melt that babbit with a lot of heat from this drill bit, because it'll stick that drill bit, and it might even tear some babbit out. So there's the 7/16 now that I went all the way through with that smaller one, and it really wants to bite hard. That babbit is so soft that it tries to advance really fast, and it's really hard to control. You just got to take your time and make sure you don't bind things up, because I don't want to break a drill bit in there, and I certainly don't want to tear any of the babbit bearing loose or damage anything there on the threads. So just get through there. Now we're through, and now we'll take a quarter NPT tap and run in that thread portion in the top. I just do that dry because we're just chasing threads that are already there and just clearing the babbit out, and the babbit's a lubricating medium anyway, so I don't really need to have oil or anything on it. It's so soft. So I don't have a tap wrench to fit that in that tight space, so I'm just using a wrench. but it's going in there pretty easily. So now that we got that done, just a quick dust off here, and we're done with that part. Well, there's the final shot of the bearing. I think it turned out really well. These Babbitt bearings aren't perfect by any means any of the time, but boy, it really turned out nice. It flowed nice. There's no voids in it, no cold spots or anything. So I'm really pleased with that. Thanks for watching the video, and thank you if you watched the whole thing. It actually helps the channel out if you do that. I know that there's some dry spots in this video, and it seems kind of long, and some of my videos are that way. There's dry spots in them, but it's just kind of the way it goes. I try to show as much as I can and keep kind of continuity on the project there, and some of it's just kind of dry and kind of hard to film. So I really appreciate it, and like I said, like and subscribe. I'm going to end up cleaning this area up just a little bit more and taking that governor bracket off, and then the next step will probably be cleaning up the base and the cylinder to get some primer on that and hopefully get it painted here before winter. So again, thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.